Hey guys and gals, it's Mike Al with Savage Kingdom's role-playing game and Fire in the Head Productions. My usual intro. Wanted to do another video. I'm actually going on vacation soon. Awesome for me, anyway. Much needed in this COVID year, as many would probably agree. So, very much looking forward to it. Meaning that I'll be taking a few days break from Savage Kingdom's writing as well as running games. Some of you know I run games professionally now, which is really cool. It's kind of a side gig because being an actor this year has not been so lucrative for obvious reasons. Theaters and even films shutting down a bit, but getting through it. So that's neither here nor there. Today's video actually is not about any of that stuff. That was just an awkward introduction. Today's video is about game mastering Savage Kingdom's 3rd edition. Part 1. In other words, this is part 1 of the video. Probably make it 2 parts, maybe 3. We'll see. But today is just part 1. I'll be covering 5 kind of basic points, and there'll be like some A, B, and C subpoints within those 5 points. But anyway, 5 basic points. So just giving you guys some tips on how to be a game master in Savage Kingdoms. It's not as difficult as some might think. I think in previous editions it was a little more difficult. One of my design goals with Savage Kingdoms 3 was to make it a little slightly more deadlier, more challenging. I hate to say deadlier, but a little more because it's called Savage Kingdoms. Success. The math easier. Numbers are kind of lower. Success, I believe, there as well. Seems to be from playtesting and stuff. And I guess the third big one is to make it easier to game master. Not that it was ever super difficult, but I'd say it's a little more difficult than, say, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition particularly. But SK3, I feel like it's probably just as simple as there are some things a little more difficult than, say, D&D 5e. I'm kind of using that as the hallmark, I suppose. But then other things, to me, and I think to others too, are actually much simpler. So, it's kind of a yin and yang type of deal. All right, so point number one, starting kind of from the top, character creation. I know that's more of a player character thing, but the game master should always work with his players about their characters, their character backgrounds, and what their character goals may be. Big thing, character motivations, goals. I know I've talked about that before. But that so often comes short. People come up with these cool character backgrounds. They're so interesting, but then they don't have any forward sight. It's like they've written backstory, but there's no forestory. Granted, the forestory is the point of playing, but there should be some, like in real life, we all have kind of like ambitions and goals. So, so make sure players kind of hit some of those, because that helps you as a game master. To kind of know where to take the campaigns. I base a lot of my campaigns and adventures off of character background stuff. I will often try to weave it in, and I know most game masters do this, try to weave it in with some major kind of possible plot arc that's going on in the campaign that has necessarily nothing to do with the player characters at the moment. They eventually become involved, and then maybe some of their backstories become intertwined with the ongoing story arc. I know this is not new news. A lot of people use this, technique. Weaving several things together. The big thing is not to weave every single thing together, because then it seems kind of artificial and fake and forced. So when you're work with your players when you're creating characters. Another point I have here in my notes, humans and non-humans. So in Savage Kingdoms, the default race or races, because there's so many different ethnicities of humans in Savage Kingdoms, is humans. It's a very human-centric setting, and that's because it's more of a almost traditional sword and sorcery feel, where almost always the heroes are humans, perhaps of these very cool exotic cultures. And encountering the non-human race is the big deal. So, in my opinion, when you let everybody play random kind of weird races, then you lose some of that exoticness. So, if half the party is these exotic races, and you encounter exotic races and interact with them, then they're not really exotic anymore. I also feel, in my personal opinion, that though it's fun to explore non-human races, there's not a lot of people that are particularly that great at it. And they could be. They just have to delve a little deeper into what it is and get away from the what's it called, the human with pointy ears syndrome. It's like I want to play an elf or a she, and they're just playing them just like a regular old person. So they're just a human with a pointed ears and no facial hair, and they're tall and lean or whatever, or the human that with a long burly beard and he's short and stocky like a tiger. So yeah, so if you're allowing the non-human races, then make sure the player that wants to be one of those really kind of understands that it's more about just the awesome abilities you get, and that's great, but more about the psyche, the interior of the character. Um, so the official rule is that non-humans are actually optional. Non-humans, as in Duergar, Alunashi, Darkshi, Wildshi, Sleer, Green Sleer, Red Sleer, Golden Sleer. Savage East will have more non-human races, such as the Tinku, Gojula, the Jan, and the Rethkiri. So yeah, the core rulebook suggests that if you do allow them, and I do personally, um, maybe to only say every four, if you have four player characters in the group, then maybe only allow one non-human, maybe two if it kind of works out, like maybe they know each other, something like that. But I wouldn't do all non-humans. Now, most of my adult players choose humans anyway. I think they see the depth of some of the richness of the cultures. Perhaps being more exposed to the world and having traveled more, they can see how some of these real world cultures are kind of mirrored in Savage Kingdoms, and I think that's of great interest to some people. So, so yeah, so it's not like, don't think like in it's almost like in D&D terms where it's like I'm human and that's it. It's like no, that tells nothing. It's like what's your nationality, what's your ethnicity, all that stuff's in Savage Kingdoms. The core rulebook I think has 12 or 13 human nationality or subracial um, offerings, and the Savage East will have think probably 14 more. So very cool. So yeah, it's not a throwaway just to say I'm human. So the non-humans may look at it like that way, like everybody, all humans kind of sort of look the same or act the same to them. Probably not true, but that's just kind of that weird stereotype attitude. So yeah, some fun things to explore and consider as a Savage Kingdoms game master working with your player characters. All right, on to number two. As a game master, think about: do you want to run a themed campaign, or um, is it just kind of open and fairly generic? I hate to say generic because some of the non-themed campaigns end up being amazingly awesome. In fact, most of them do, I think, in my opinion. Sometimes a themed campaign can be a little too restrictive and forced and not organic. So be careful there. So I would suggest just kind of somewhere in the middle. So in other words, here's what I mean by a themed campaign, and you guys probably know, but in case you don't, something that's very thematic. Think about a theme park. The word theme park exists because it is themed to something, such as the Wizarding World of Harry Potter is themed to Harry Potter, right? Um, Animal Kingdom at Disney is themed to animals and their characters that have to do with it, like the Lion King, stuff like that. So just think about what that means. So themed a haunted house, and during Halloween can be themed to certain things, a killer clown house, or a Frankenstein's monster house, or a zombie house, or whatever. So think about your campaign. Does it want to be yeah, and you could think of those terms. Do you want to run a campaign that might be heavy with undead, particularly zombies or something, apocalyptic zombie stuff, uh, or themed in the sense of more traditional themes, such as literary themes? Is it going to be barbarism versus civilization, which is very much a Robert E. Howard theme? The original Conan author. Um, Stuff like that, or is it themed in? Is it the theme? Is it hope? Is the theme hopelessness, darkness? Are you setting it in the far north where it's during the winter and it's cold and dark most of the time? Or is it the opposite? Is it a jungle setting where it's sweaty and humid and life forms are teeming in the jungle, in the rainforest, or whatever? So Yeah, so just think about themes. So as you can see, there's all these different types of theming and sub-theming that you can do within the setting. Now, the setting itself already has its own kind of built-in themes, right? Like, so if you start a campaign in the far north of the Astagonian continent, which is the Western continent, and Savage Kingdoms, say around in the Thoraki tribes, Thoraki clans, you already have some kind of built-in theming there, right? You're starting in kind of this cold, ice, very savage area. And then maybe you layer on another theming where they're going to possibly be dealing with undead hordes or frost giants, because frost giants can be a problem up there. Or maybe they're about to raid the Dwargar kingdom of Thrimnor, deeper down into the mountains, etc. Stuff like that. Or maybe they're taking raids on Scathia, which is kind of a semi-civilized northern country, so kind of Scandinavian-esque. So yeah, stuff like that. So wherever you start your campaign, think about what kind of theme that you already have going, in addition to whatever themes you may be wanting to explore. The reason I keep using the word maybe and possibly is I tend to, I don't like railroading people, and it seems like it happens sometimes. I think some of my players think that and I'm not sure if that's a good or bad thing. I'm now thinking I'm starting to learn to trust myself a little bit better as I get older and more experienced in doing, not only as an actor, but as a game master and game designer. I think I'm starting to trust myself now more, that I think I'm doing the right thing there. But I used to be thinking that some players will be like, okay, we get it. We keep hearing these rumors about this thing, and I'm like, that's just verisimilitude. That's just NPCs talking. So don't assume that because an NPC is saying, "My God, my family were lost in the marshes. I need someone to go and find them, or my livestock is missing, or something. I don't know why I'm suddenly Maluvian." Um, that's just could be splash set dressing. So I think so. As a game master, be aware of that. Do all the stuff. Like I would say, trust yourself. Trust yourself with having the NPC say this thing without railroading. Um, and if you don't want to railroad, have the player characters be exposed to several rumors going on. Now, the only reason you really need to hear rumors and adventure hooks in the first place is because the player characters, again, going back to my early point, sometimes don't have this motivation to do anything within the setting other than to explore and get treasure. And that's all well and good, but so like in the real world, most of us have deeper things, to do. We don't usually wake up and go, I'm just going to randomly wander around through town or through the woods and see if I can find some treasure, um, or find some adventure. That would be hiking or something, which is awesome. But again, you would wake up with that plan to go hiking, right? So yeah, if the player characters have decent motivations, they may already have things that they want to do, and you don't even have to throw them really any plot hooks, or very many. I still suggest having NPCs say stuff and have rumors being heard and overheard and messages intercepted, however, whatever method you want the information to get out there. I say still do that, just to let them, because I like to remind my players that the world is a living world. Things are happening regardless of what they do. Hopefully, the player characters, at least on a local level, when they're first starting off, can affect things and perhaps later on at higher advancements, they can affect things on a kingdom scale, or perhaps even greater than that. But at the same time, let them know that this world is there. It's not waiting for them. There's millions of other people doing things in the setting, and that's an author tip. If, any good fantasy novel you've read, or any kind of novel, nonfiction novel you've read, that's good world building. Things are still happening in the background despite what the protagonists are doing. So yeah, that's about theming and also some plot hooky stuff right there. All right, on to number 3. Kind of a big one with a lot of people. Combat, and I wrote down combat in the single D20. And the reason I put that is to remind me that I mostly want to touch on a couple things in this little combat section. So in Savage Kingdoms, a single D20 is your hit and your damage all in one roll, which is rather nice. I designed that way because I wanted it to be kind of quicker. And I remember in early days of playing D&D, and I still play and run D&D actually fairly often for after-school kids and stuff, and clubs, summer camps. Um, it was always a little frustrating that you would roll, like, your attack roll would end up, it could have been a 24, and your Olegus an armor class of 13, and went 9 over the number that you needed. It didn't really matter. And then you end up rolling damage, and you rolled minimum damage. So it was kind of weird because as a game master, I'd always describe that. Oh man, you just clocked it. You get under this shield, this guy's shield, and just drive it deep into. And then you're basing your description off the attack roll, and then I've eventually learned later to wait for the damage roll to be rolled, or to roll it at the same time as the attack dice. Nice little tip for you DMs out there to make games going quicker, especially combats. So anyway, my point is there. I think it got muddled in all of that commentary. That in Savage Kingdoms, it's just a single d20. So if you, the way it works, and you probably already know this, is that say your opponent's defense is say 14, and you're using a spear and you're +5 with it with your melee weaponry skill. We'll say you're +4, but you're specialized in a spear, so that's +5 with spear, right? So, and you roll a 15, add the 5 to it, you got a 20. Compare 20 to the 14. You succeeded by 6. You did 6 points of base damage, and then if the weapon has armor piercing, that's basically bonus damage. So, say the spear is a war spear, and you're using it two-handed. That's armor piercing 1, so 1 more point of damage. So 6 points of damage instead of 5. Simple as that. You're already done. You've already done your attack roll, and you rolled all your 3d8 plus 2d6 or whatever else you need to roll, would roll in some other games, which are great. We all like dice, and sometimes it's fun to just roll tons of different dice. But the intent in this design actually was to make it a little bit quicker, and to reward people on those high rolls with the d20s, especially if you explode at 20, because as you probably know, Savage Kingdoms 30, well, actually all editions of Savage Kingdoms explodes on a 20. You get a natural 20, you add your modifier, whatever, if you had one, they probably do, and then you roll the d20 again, it explodes, and you add that raw result, unmodified result, to the first result. If you get a 20 again, it explodes, and you do the same thing. So now in combat, weapons are capped. There's a maximum damage to every type of weapon, including claws and teeth and punches and kicks from creatures and animals and martial artists and pugilists, I guess, as well. For example, a dagger is a maximum damage of 10 for an average quality dagger, presumably made of steel or iron at least, and all the way up to like a great axe is like maximum damage of 30 with armor piercing of 3 for an average quality. So you could actually end up doing 33 points damage with a great axe if you roll high enough above someone's defense. As you can see, that would kill most humans, or at least knock them unconscious, and a lot of bigger beasts too. That's going to a pretty sizable chunk into their health. That will probably stagger most of them. Stagger means you're at half health or less. So keep that in mind. The single d20 and combat does all of that for you. So the next thing I have written down is description. This is in the combat section. Description and evocation. So that's kind of based on the roll. So that was the kind of the design intent. So that way you're not waiting for the damage dice, and you're not. Hopefully it's once you get the system down, it's like it's smooth. It runs pretty fast. It's very narrative. It flows. That's kind of the point. And it allows you to be more descriptive and less kind of clunky and awkward, waiting for all the damage dice to roll and then saying, oh no, wait, you had advantage. And wait, actually, then the sneak attack is another 2d6. Don't forget to add your dexterity modifier. And that's all well and good, but it does kind of slow the game down a little bit. So marry your description and your evocation to what's happening with the dice. And also don't forget about what weapon type. If somebody's swinging a mace or a maul or a warhammer, you're not slashing into people and causing lacerations in general, unless you're hitting them super hard. You're causing bruising damage and broken bones and armor to be mail links to be rendered, to be split asunder, and plated armor to be bent, and leather armor just to be almost completely ignored. So a lot of that kind of fun, almost kind of quasi-historical stuff, feel free to use those in your description. Savage Kingdoms is based on, there's a historical fantasy feel to it. Obviously, it's fantasy, it's sword and sorcery, not hiding that fact. But a lot of people point out, and this is on purpose, that it's fairly grounded. So it's very married, for the most part, to medieval, particularly Dark Ages history. So if you're a bit of scholar of that or a student of it or even just a fan of it, this is a good moment to pull out some of that stuff you know about, like how a Warhammer reacts with Brigandine armor or something. I mean, it's super nerdy, obviously, but this is your chance to do that. I mean, other role playing games are more or less based on that as well, but they don't. Sometimes they don't pay quite as much attention to that. So uh, take advantage of that. Take advantage of the fact that that single D20 is making the game quicker, and you can be more evocative in your descriptions of what happened. The players can surely feel free to describe. In fact, I encourage them to say at least what their intent is. I tend to actually narrate the results myself for the most part. I know some game masters go, and that's fine. They're like, yes, you hit, or you succeed. Tell me what happens. Um, I personally find that through experience of doing this for a while that kind of slows it down a little bit. And there's some players that most players probably actually enjoy that to some degree. Some players don't really want that. They're almost like they know that that's kind of your job, and so they're there to play the game. They might describe what their intent is, and then but they expect you in proper improv technique to take the hand off and then complete your part of it. So look at it like improv, like you described something in a scene, and then you're handing it over. You're saying yes and to the next person, which would be the game master. So that's my personal way of doing it. But I do love when a player like doesn't just say, "I make my battle axe attack roll," and cool, an 18, and that's fine. Whatever, I'll take over from there. But it's more exciting when they're like, I plant back in even though the mud is slippery under my boots, and I really just this two hand this axe towards this opponent that's infuriating. It's been in my face for long moments. It doesn't have to be that ridiculous, but then the die roll, the mechanical stuff happens, and we see what the mechanical part happens, whether it's a success or a minor success, or maybe it's exploding to a critical success. Remember, a critical is 20 above the difficulty level that's needed. In combat, the difficulty level is generally the defense of the creature. So yeah, that's a critical success. 20 or above what you need. And that again opens up more doors. There are critical success charts and the melee weaponry skill descriptions, as well as the range weaponry skill descriptions and brawling. Those are your three kind of main sort of physical combat skills. Certain spells can be described too, especially like fire and lightning type effects. Are always kind of fun to describe too. But again, you can use that kind of your sense of history, particularly medieval history, to kind of describe a long sword strike or a great sword strike or a dagger twist or a shield block, a shield rotation, a shield rush, building a shield wall and overlapping the shields, all that kind of cool, at least to me, very cool, evocative, and very fun stuff. So yeah, so be cool with the description and kind of marry to what's happening based on the weapon and based on the creature. A creature with, say, a brown bear with massive claws. I mean, like the size of your head, slashing into you. Just think about, you've seen nature shows, you've seen stuff on the internet. What is that really doing? And then just now imagine that in sort of medieval garb or armor. What's happening there? So. Yeah, so just be descriptive and evocative and have fun with it. All right, I think it's enough for the combat stuff. Wait, it seemed like there was one last thing with combat. Yeah, just one little thing I'll tag on. So remember I mentioned armor piercing with weapons. So weapons have, I think I call them characteristics. I'm looking for the Savage Kingdoms 3 books right there. I don't need to show you. So weapon characteristics or character traits, weapon traits. I think I call them weapon characteristics. Regardless, so armor piercing is just one of those traits or characteristics. Other weapons have certain things as well. So don't forget those. If you look in the equipment chapter, there's a whole line. There's like a chart of all the weapons with the maximum damage and armor piercing and how much they cost, like on the open market, blah, blah, blah. And they'll also list armor piercing if it has it. A lot of weapons don't have armor piercing, particularly one-handed medium and light weapons, for obvious reasons. They're just kind of light. They're not really made to pierce armor. So But there's some other things like conceal, like a dagger, I think has the conceal characteristics, which gives you a +2 bonus if you're trying to hide it on your person using the disguise skill or even sleight of hand. Another one is disarm. The disarm characteristic, that weapon gains a +2 bonus on attack rolls when you're trying to disarm someone. Flails do that because the chain can wrap around the opponent's weapon. Whips can do that. I think there's maybe a quarterstaff may have that too. But let's see. Reach is another weapon characteristic. All weapons are assumed to be reach 1, which means 1 yard reach. You can attack an opponent that's 1 yard away from you. If you're using a grid, that's 1 space away. So, for example, D&D 5th edition, each square is 5 feet, generally, if you're doing a 1-inch square scale. The Savage Kingdoms 1 square or hex is a yard. So, 3 feet instead of 5 feet, but fairly close. But in Savage Kingdoms 3, we use yards because yards are more outdoors based. That's the point of that measurement, because they're paces, they're yards, strides. So feet don't really work as well when you're describing like a long distance outdoors. Now it works better like sort of in dungeons or underground or even cities. So feel free to convert to feet if you want to, but in general, I would suggest just staying with yards or paces or strides, same thing. And it's a little bit more medieval as well. Esque. So, yeah, weapon characteristics. So don't forget those. Some of those are pretty cool. There's another one called Prestige that I always forget myself. It's a prestige weapon. Carrying that type of weapon, like where you can at least see most of it, gains +1 renown to the player character. Those are swords. I think pretty much all swords, except for short sword. Anything from a long sword or better of exceptional quality counts as renown. Counts as a prestige weapon, +1 to renown. Yeah, it's mostly swords because again, using a little bit of historical fantasy here, back in the day, having a sword in many cultures that was a big deal. I mean, that was because they took a lot of skill to make. You had to fold and temper the steel a lot, and it used a lot of metal in the first place, whereas a spear used only about a third as much or a quarter as much, uh, relying on wood for the most of it, which was a little easier to deal with. So that's why they were prestige weapons. And artisans could also, I mean, if you've seen sword hilts, some of the sword hilts with Celtic knotwork designs and gems inlaid in them, so you can make them like works of art. Not that you can't necessarily other weapons as well, but particularly swords. So, right. On to the next. Number 4, exploration and travel. Travel and exploration. Probably should have worded it that way. Travel and exploration. All right. So I broke this down into a couple categories. So encounters and scenes. So when the player characters are traveling across the countryside, as just mentioned, or underground, or whether it's on horseback, whether it's on foot, whether it's by chariot or wagon or by ship or river galley, whatever, they are traveling and therefore exploring. Maybe if they're traveling to an area they already know, they grew up in, maybe that's not necessarily exploring, but the two are pretty much married. So the biggest thing that happens in Savage Kingdoms and any tabletop role-playing game, fantasy in particular, the meat of probably the game is called the encounter, or what I prefer to call scene as an actor. Encounter works too. That goes back to old school D&D. Gary Gygax called them encounters because the game is based more on military. So that's why you get military terminology such as an encounter, such as a campaign. It's very military. All this stuff has kind of remained with us, and that's all well and good. So, but just think of an encounter as a scene, which I kind of prefer personally. And a scene, the reason I like to call them scenes is that a scene will do one of several things. An encounter, I guess, kind of will too, but it's more of a game mechanic-y thing. So a scene is going to further the story. It's almost like a sub-chapter within a chapter. Whether it's to further the character's growth, character's personality, maybe it showcases a talent that one or two or all of them have. Maybe it harkens to something from their past. Maybe they run into a mentor, or their mother or father, or brother or sister. Um, or the scene is also moving the main plot forward. So say they're on a quest to recover a abducted princess. And so this next encounter or scene has directly to do with that. Maybe they're running into palace guards that are also looking for her, and maybe they could be in conflict with the player characters. Maybe they don't want the player characters involved, or maybe they want to work together. Maybe they want to. What I would often do is kind of leave it open, and depending on how they role play, how the social reaction goes, perhaps based on persuasion skill rolls and that sort of thing. Um, so yeah. So a scene could either be, like I said, it can either forward a main story arc. It can kind of call back to one of the player characters' past. It can even foreshadow some things that's coming up. One of my favorite kind of encounters is the old crone, the old woman, wise woman who sees the future. Doesn't have to be a woman. Doesn't even have to be wise, but just as an example. And she is kind of a fortune teller. Maybe she has second sight and sees glimpses of what could possibly happen to the player characters. What I like about that is that it's mysticism, which I kind of like. Mysticism and mystery should, in my opinion, almost always be a part of a game session. And number two, it also gives you and the player both ideas of what could possibly happen. I've had NPCs just spout random things that I really had no idea. They just kind of came out of my head improv wise. Or I might base it kind of on their past, which is what I usually do, kind of at least base it on their past, and say, I see a cloud of shadows around you. The cloud of shadows from all around it's cold and dark. I see no more. So by seeing that alone, they're now like, "Oh, this is kind of cool. What if it's real? What if it does happen?" And you, as a person, as a game master, are now like you can remember that or write it down, and perhaps bring a scene in later on that where that actually occurs or seems to occur. The trick in like fortune teller, the people that aren't actually gifted in say second sight, assuming such things exist, which I personally kind of think they do, but that's a different story. The trick with like chicanery and sort of was the trick is to psychology, right? You're trying to lead the person into to believe. It's like when you read a fortune, it says you will meet a mysterious stranger, and then your mind automatically goes, "Oh my God, that's right. Yesterday I met that weird dude." The thing is, though, even without the fortune teller thing, that you probably would have met the weird dude, but it doesn't stand out in your memory because the fortune teller was the cue, right? It's the thing that triggered it. So yeah, so you can make the encounter kind of like that, like where it's just kind of vague, and when it happens, they're like, "Oh my God, this is the shadow thing that she's talking about." And it may not even totally be; it just happens to be a scene where you're described it being kind of shadowy, or maybe it totally is, and you can set it up to be a main plot point later on if you want that person to be really like an actual prophet who often is correct. Oracle is often correct in his or her predictions. So. So these are the type of scenes that you could be doing. The obvious sort of encounter is because it really is a combat, and if you take it back to the military terminology, it generally means a combat encounter, which sometimes can still, in military speak, can still turn out to be like a parlay, but it's often it's a hostile potentiality is what it means. So it's role-playing games, an encounter can be almost anything, which is, again, why I like to call it a scene. But they could easily become combat. For example, say, go back to the example of the palace guards looking for the princess as well as the player characters. And they come in conflict with each other, and somebody says something bad, insults somebody, or maybe the palace guards are already sort of hostile, they don't want the player characters around. Maybe there's a certain player character that whose race or ethnicity they don't like, or whose backstory they don't like their renown is high enough that they know about the person. They don't, whatever the case is. They could come into conflict, and suddenly this what you thought was a social scene becomes a combat scene, and that's totally fine. By the way, a lot of new game masters, I think, game masters and dungeon masters, um, worry a little too much, in my opinion, on what needs to be. Oh, this is going to be a combat, and this is going to be talking, and this will be a trap. It's like, that's cool to plan that out roughly, but don't get completely married to it, because I guarantee you that will not always happen. In fact, often it will not. In fact, and I actually kind of enjoy it. I kind of enjoy encounter where it looks like a social kind of chill out encounter, and then suddenly swords are being drawn, or fisticuffs are being performed, or insults are being, whatever stuff that you didn't expect is happening. Or perhaps even better, a scene that you're like, oh yeah, this is almost totally going to be this is going to be a throwdown. They're not going to like this guy, or they're not going to like this creature, and then somehow a parlay happens and they see eye to eye, or at least they see enough to kind of go about each other's way without getting in each other's way and necessarily becoming like fast friends or something. But that's happened also. So yeah, so don't get married to necessarily what's going to happen, what you think is going to happen in the encounter. All right, speaking of encounters and scenes, there is in the core rule book, there is a chart for random encounters, which is cool. That was one of the last things I kind of wrote. I sort of decided, I was like, I think I'm going to add some, excuse me, some random encounter charts. So I didn't have them in the previous editions. So you don't have to use them. They're fairly basic, but it's kind of there, kind of gives you an idea. They're just broken down into Arctic, subarctic, temperate, and subtropical and tropical charts to roll, and that's all it is. And there's like, it's a D20. It's like I said, it's pretty simple, but it does give you a framework. I think I even wrote in there that's like this kind of uses the basis. You can write some subcharts out, or you can tweak it as the way you want to. But it's kind of there to at least give the GM an idea, like especially a new game master who may not be familiar with the setting. Just be like, I don't know where it really lives in this area. Okay, I'm just gonna roll, see what happens, and a trick with random encounter rolls is to be open to them. It's not to don't let the table rule you as the game master. You rule the table. You're the dude or the lady or the whatever. You're the master. There's a reason it's called game master. So you can use those rules to. What I often do is to just kind of spur my imagination on. So kind of roll it. You say you roll zombies and you're like, it's kind of weird in this area, or don't really feel like it doing with that, and then you can be, but just use that as the general. This is another improv thing. A word comes up and you play off of that word. It doesn't have to be literal zombies. It could be people that are you come to a city where people are hopped up on Dream Lotus or Pink Lotus. This is actually like one of the Conan stories. Uh, and they're just zombie-like. They're just completely out of reality, and that can make an interesting scene, encounter, perhaps a whole adventure. Why are they doing that? Do the player characters care? Is there a cultist that's drugging them in order to be these kind of mindless zombies or something? Or maybe it's a military thing. They're trying to brainwash these people into becoming like these fearless soldiers or something. So yeah, so from that one word zombie, all of that stuff is created right there. It doesn't have to be literal. Say you roll dragon and you're like, oh my god, I don't want them to necessarily encounter a dragon, even if it's a younger one, even as rare they are in the setting. Maybe it could be something draconic. Maybe it's a draconic cult. These spring up fairly often in Savage Kingdoms if you read the lore. Or maybe it's a dead dragon. It's a dragon corpse, and you got to figure out what happened to it if they care. Or maybe they find a shield covered in dragon scales. So there's all sorts of ways you can do with just that random chart. Just kind of giving you ideas. It doesn't have to be literal. So just know that that's that. Speaking of random charts, there's also a weather chart. So don't forget about weather with exploration and travel. I always do this. I know some of my players, I think I kind of sense they get a little annoyed with it, but I'm always, like almost every day, remind them how the weather is, because I'm trying to be descriptive. I'm trying to give them, I want them to be in the world, like what's their character feeling? It's like, remember, the world is not a white room. There's mountains and swamp and smells and leaves falling and snow blowing, perhaps, or frozen lakes, unfrozen lakes, swollen rivers that are flooding over, fords that were once easy to like ride through and are now 5 feet deep. Just think of all this cool stuff. Not to overcomplicate everything and not to blow your mind, but this is if you can be good with it and flow with it and not overdo it, but remember to add it splashes of this here and there. It really will completely make the game 300% better. Trust me on that. So don't forget about weather. There's a weather chart in here, which is really nice. 1d20. And it's fairly generic. It's not there's not subtables about in autumn or winter or what part of the world. It's just fairly generic. It does list a few things, like if you're in this part of the world, it would be a blizzard, and this part of this world might be a monsoon. Other than that, it's fairly generic. So don't forget about that, or you can use your own method if you want. There's also a hazards chart, which is really cool. Another not really a last minute thing, I guess, in the writing process, but kind of towards the end, decided to come up with this thing. So now you get to decide your travel pace. Whether it's a normal travel pace, that's the default. A stealthy or slow travel pace, where you can use stealth, but you're going really slow. like half speed, I think. And then there's the forced march, or the hustle, the fast travel, um, the hard ride, as it were, if you were riding, and that's 1.5 times the speed that you would make. So, if for example, say you're only according to your mobility and terrain, you might only been probably making 20 miles in a day. If you decide to hard ride, if you're mounted, I mean, you could even be on foot, but this means you're going to be jogging most of the way. You might get 30 miles in the day. However, you're going to end up losing more stamina after your 10-hour normal sort of travel day. Also, at the beginning of each day, you can do this as a game master. It's in the book. You don't have to use it, but it's kind of cool. The main leader of the player, like sort of the main scout, makes a survival check, and if they hit a certain DL on a major road, it's easy. It's only like difficulty level 5, or you don't even have to roll it at all, actually. If it's off on a little woodland path that's not very well known, maybe through hostile territory, then the deal might be as high as 15. If they fail the survival check, then you roll randomly on this hazard table. They could run into quicksand, a flooded river, a chasm that's difficult to cross. They could go around it, but it may cost them an hour or two if they care. Otherwise, it's a nice little physical challenge. Say with athletics and acrobatics rolls, stuff like that. Maybe animal handling if they can try to jump it with a horse. Stuff like that. Festering dead is kind of one of my favorite. They come upon a area of festering corpses. It smells horrible. They can be sickened by it. If they really explore it, it might be a plot hook to like what happened here. Yeah, there's some more things. Oh, wildfire. They can come across a wildfire in the forest. If it's near a village, do they help the villagers out? Do they not care? Do they put the fire out? Do they not care, etc.? So yeah, some fun stuff can like that happen. And if you don't want to do the actual mechanical rolls for it, at least they're all there, and it lists like all they're fairly detailed about what skills might be involved, skill rolls and stuff like that. So you can still look at it and go, man, I have this storyline in mind that the forest might be on fire. Oh, cool. Here's a little section about wildfire. Here's how I might handle it. Here's a section about quicksand, something like that. So don't forget about weather, hazards, and encounters and scenes during your exploration and travel. All right, final thing, since this video is slightly longer than I thought it was going to be. Number 5, social scenes. Social scenes. I covered some of that actually already back in the last one because I got on a little tangent about scenes encounters that can also be social encounters. Social scenes. So don't forget about persuasion and the specialties of the persuasion skill. These will come in often a lot in social scenes. Whether you're visiting a king as an emissary, whether you're bargaining with a merchant for a lower price or something. Persuasion is generally the skill that's going to be used there. Performance, too, would come up fairly often depending on the character. You can perform in taverns or before a lord as a traveling minstrel or skald or bard, or maybe just as a normal, regular person who's very good at orating or telling stories. Possibly getting you some benefits there, maybe even earning a few coin for the night, or at least a room in an inn. So yeah, social scenes can be really cool if you. So my suggestion here is to play out most of it and then do a skill roll only when there's a point where you're not quite sure what the NPC would do, or if you touch upon a nerve, like if you know this NPC has a weakness, like has a phobia of fire, and the person is performing with a torch or speaking with a lantern, maybe that makes him a little more nervous, and so maybe he's less likely to be amiable. So yeah, kind of fun stuff like that. There'll also be social talents that come in a lot. So Savage Kingdoms 3 has a whole category of talents called um, social talents, and those are things like gossip and lampoon, exaltation, mariner, woodsman, stuff like that. Gambler. So those might come up a lot. A player character may decide to spend the next 3 hours in a tavern using the gambler talent to make some money or to hear some rumors or whatever. The carouser talent. You're less likely to get inebriated with the carouser talent, and you're also good at sort of carousing and sort of reveling and sort of picking up gossip and information, that sort of thing. So social scenes can be really fun using persuasion. And just a quick reminder, I think a lot of people confuse, and I almost do occasionally as well. Intimidation is a specialty of persuasion. It's not its own skill. So I've had a couple people argue with that, and I get their point, but intimidation still is a form of persuasion. It's a bully sort of over the top form, granted, usually, but it is a form of persuasion. If you're intimidating someone, you're still trying to persuade them to do something, either to leave you alone or to give you something that you have to force them to give it to you because they're not being cooperative otherwise. So still a form of persuasion. The other specialties are things like bluffing and deception. Those are really the same. They're just different words. Diplomacy, being diplomatic. I've had somebody take courtesy before, which to me is very similar to diplomacy. If you really take it to the original word court, then maybe it applies mostly in a court setting among nobles, if you really want to break it down. But yeah, so don't forget about your social scenes and social talents. All right, I think that's enough about that. This video went a little longer than I want, but hopefully it was chock full of information. And I will do part 2 probably when I come back from vacation after 5 or 6 days or so. So, all right, guys, thanks for hanging in there. Hopefully this helped you a lot, and I will talk to you again soon.